Hi, in this video I'm going to show you the breakdown of this cloudy sunset scene I made in Blender and Photoshop. So let's jump first into Blender. Now in Blender this is how the scene looks. The first thing I did was to add a camera with the default resolution as you can see here. I used a focal length of about 33 mm for a wider view of the scene. And also activated Passapart Out with value 1 to have a better idea on how the final render is going to look. Now, this scene is basically composed of multiple planes going bigger and bigger as you get farther of the camera. To position them is useful to have the camera view on one side. So now what I did was to move and scale those planes in order to cover the camera view, and to simulate the idea of a large terrain. This planes compose the foreground, midground and background of the scene. Now, these planes were subdivided a few times. And also I added a subdivision modifier to have more geometry for the displacement of the texture. After that, I added a displace modifier with a cloud's texture so this terrain doesn't look too flat. You can edit their parameters to have different variations. Another thing I did was to use the sculpt mode to have more variation on the terrain. The material I used is a PBR material from Megascans. This material by default is too big, so I used a value node to scale the texture in all axes at the same time. For this is useful to have a human reference in the scene as you see here. I also plugged a hue saturation node on the albedo to desaturate a bit the color of the texture. This PBR material comes by default with a displacement texture as you can see here. This displacement is just visible in cycles, not in Eevee. For it to work you have to go to the material properties and change the displacement to displacement only, or displacement and bump. Now, the rocks are Megascans meshes with PBR materials. These rocks came by default with different colors, so I desaturated them in order to match the color of the terrain. Then I positioned them and made multiple copies using Alt+D. I rotated and scaled these copies to give them a different look. I also superposed some of them to have even more variations. Now, the big plane on the top was used to simulate light through clouds. His material is this set of nodes. It is basically a noise texture connected to the alpha with a color ramp which controls the intensity of this clouds. With Alt+click on the node you can see a preview of how it looks. I also combined this with another grayscale texture. This is a black image on which I use texture paint to paint a white strip to have more light entering from this part. Then, I mixed them using a mix node. Now, the lighting is basically an HDRI of a cloudy sunset with strength at 0.5. Then I rotated it to position the direction of the sun. I also added a sunlight with a subtle warm tint and an intensity of 2. Then I rotated it so it points to the camera. Another thing I did was to change the angle of the light. This parameter controls the hardness of the shadows. Here you can see how the plane above changes the lighting of the scene. Now, I changed to cycles to see a more realistic result. I usually use Eve just to see a quick preview of the scene. To hide the plane above from the camera view I went to the object properties and in ray visibility disabled camera. Also I didn't want it to render the HDRI image, so I went to render properties and in film I enabled transparent. Then I made the render using cycles with 500 samples and default light paths parameters. Now, an useful render pass is the mist pass. It will allow us to add depth to the scene. For this, first you need to enable it in the View Layer properties. Then go to the World properties and edit their parameters. Always make sure to cover all the meshes with the grayscale values. Then you can go to View, Viewport Render Image and save it. Now, here in Photoshop, this is how the final image looks. Let's go quick to each step of the compositing. This is the render from Blender. As you can see, it looks dark by default. Now what I did was to add a background sky. This was constructed with one image copied multiple times. Then I joined them and fixed the hard lines with the clone stamp tool. Then I masked the rock formation of this image and put it in the background. Then I applied the mist pass by putting the image in screen mode with an opacity of 35%. You can see that it creates the idea of depth in the scene. Then I added light rays to increase the sunlight. Then I added this person, which I masked from this image using the pen tool. Then I painted dark areas with black color, and then made his shadow using distort. Then I made double click on this layer and put it black as color overlay, and to soften it I used Gaussian blur. Then I painted some additional shadows with black color and low opacity. Then added some additional effects. The first one is a curves to increase the light that comes from this part. I masked this part as you can see here. Then I added the futuristic bleak color lookup, a levels adjustment layer, and another color lookup in edgy amber with low opacity to give it a subtle warm tint. And this is the final result. Thanks for watching.